This year's Doctor Who Children in Need minisode saw Davros return for the first time in, 8 years? And we saw him as we'd never seen him before, in full humanoid, sort of pre-mutated form. But if comments subsequently made by Russell T Davies are anything to go by, this isn't just a one-off look. In fact, this could be the new look for Davros going forward. So if you don't know, this brand new minisode was accompanied by the very first instalments of Doctor Who Unleashed, the brand new BBC 3/iPlayer documentary behind the scenes series that will accompany each episode of Doctor Who in this new era. It was a fantastic little piece in its own right, sort of only about 10 to 15 minutes long, but really gave an insight into just how they made this thing. Lovely little interviews with David Tennant. It reveals little behind the scenes tidbits like, for instance, how this was shot on David Tennant's birthday this year when he came back to do some stuff. It wasn't shot alongside the specials last year, it was a much more recent thing. And you also hear from Russell T Davies, the showrunner, returning showrunner of Doctor who had some things to say about the decision to bring back Davros. So in a nutshell, RTD said that they had some conversations about bringing Davros back and how to deal with the character, because he says, he's a fantastic character, but time and society and culture and taste have moved on. And he notes how Davros falls into this unfortunate stereotype and trope of wheelchair users or disabled people or disfigured people who are also evil. And although it's not, explicit, what's always implicit with things like that, with characters like that, with villains like that, is that these characters are evil because of their disability. It's the thing that made them evil in the first place, and that in turn creates this association between the two things, between disability and evilness, and that is a problem. Now, before anyone gets their pitchforks out based on that comment alone, let's just say actually, yes, that part is completely fair enough. I don't think anyone can dispute that, really. It's not something that has always been at the forefront of the conversation surrounding Davros. Maybe for disabled people that has been a more sort of obvious thing. I think for the casual fan or for the general fan, it's not something that you immediately think of or that comes to mind with Davros. But yeah, that is something that's there, and outside Doctor Who as well, this stereotype, this trope, like it or not, is a real thing. There are examples of it across all sorts of media and things. I think one example that people have kind of talked about a lot is James Bond, where you have these disfigured villains where this disfigurement, like I say, is implied to be the thing that made them evil in the first place and the reason why they're evil, and it creates this unfortunate, unhelpful association between the two things. It is a thing, Google it if you don't believe me, but yeah, that is an actual trope. That is something we can't dispute. That is completely valid and completely fair. And just to put a finger on why that is a bad thing, for the avoidance of any doubts, it's basically saying, implicitly that disfigurement, disability, etc. is inherently a bad thing in itself. It creates association with evil, like I say. It kind of suggests that it's something to be scared of as well, to fear. It plays into all of these unhelpful kind of things that, as a disabled person, and I can't speak, obviously, myself from this point of view, but, I can't imagine that as a disabled person, that is a particularly nice way to see yourself presented in the media. And especially when, there is a real dearth, or has been historically a real dearth, of positive representations of people in wheelchairs or with disabilities or whatever they may be. When TV and films are sort of dominated by these evil representations of disabled and disfigured people, then yeah, the kind of the balance there is sort of way off. So RTD basically says that is the kind of reasoning behind why they brought Davros back in the way that they did for this minisode for Children in Need. Now, obviously, in this particular case, there is an actual in-universe reason as well, which is much more obvious. So namely, the fact that, as I said before, this is Davros before he became the Davros we know, before he experimented on himself or was scarred or disfigured or whatever it was that happened to him to turn him into the Davros that we meet in Genesis of the Daleks. There is a story reason there. This is like a prequel for Davros, much like, in Series 9, in the Series 9 opener, we meet the child Davros, and in a similar vein, that is a version of Davros that is not sitting in the chair and is not withered and disfigured. That is just like a young child. And similarly, this is Davros as a sort of an older man. And that would have been reason enough, an explanation enough for what is going on here. But no, Russell has said actually, he's added this extra element to the conversation. He's said, no, this isn't just a one-off thing. It's not just for that story reason. There's another reason as well, and that is going to inform how we approach the character of Davros in the future too. I say this is how we see Davros now. this is what he looks like. This is 2023, this is our lens. Things used to be black and white. They're not black and white anymore. And Davros used to look like that. And he looks like this now. And that we are absolutely standing by. He also goes on to say that in the context of children in need, it would in itself have been inappropriate to depict Davros in the way he's traditionally been depicted, because that is a night all about charity and where issues of disability are brought to the forefront. And so, yes, those things wouldn't have lined up. It wouldn't have been a very tasteful thing to do. And I think, yes, even if you don't like this decision very much in terms of the broader issue here of how Davros is presented in the TV show going forward, I think actually that is something that you sort of can't really dispute, to be honest, that, in the context of children in need, it wouldn't have been appropriate or tasteful or sensitive to do something with the Davros we know. But that was in the past. What about the future? What about the future of how Davros is depicted? Because these comments have prompted quite the discourse, quite the debate among fans. As you could probably predict, it's not something that's gone down all that well with certain people, and to some extent understandably, because this is a very big sort of change. It sort of feels to me like a kind of bigger change than the Time as Child thing, in a way, for better or for worse. I think personally for me, I certainly understand and appreciate the reasoning Russell has given and agree with that, and, acknowledge the existence of this trope and how Davros, through no fault, conscious fault of anybody involved with Doctor Who's production in the past, in the 70s or 80s or whatever, it's no one's fault that this has happened and has been the way it was. But yes, that is the past, and we don't necessarily have to do things the same way now. I'm certainly open to that idea, while it does sort of feel a little bit kind of, sort of bittersweet, this change and the suggestion of change here. If it's for the right reasons, I think that is, at the end of the day, what matters the most, and I'm certainly open to the idea, because what Russ is basically suggesting here is a new sort of form for Davros, quite literally, where we would have the humanoid version, played by Gillian Bleach or whatever actor, appearing in the future, without the prosthetics, without the chair, without all of that stuff and all those associations, but still, at the end of the day, being Davros and being an evil, magnificently, wonderfully wicked villain and delivering a fantastic performance. Arguably, without the prosthetics, it would actually make it easier to do a really good Davros performance, because I think in the past, with Doctor Who and stuff like that, the prosthetics sometimes hamper the performance. It sometimes gets in the way of a really good performance, or an actor gets buried underneath the prosthetics. Whereas, with Davros, there is the potential to do so much more. We had a brief glimpse of Gillian Bleach doing that in this minisode, and I certainly wouldn't be averse to seeing that again in the future on a much bigger scale. I think the one thing I would say, and the one place where I do sort of agree with people to some extent, is that it would sort of be a shame to lose that iconic Davros imagery forever. The idea of the half Dalek and half human, or Khaled or whatever, that is a sort of iconic Doctor Who image. Not as iconic as stuff like the Daleks themselves, or the Cybermen, the TARDIS, K9, or whatever. But nevertheless, that sort of feels like part of Doctor Who's DNA and part of Davros's DNA as well. But there's no reason why, number one, you couldn't just retain that in some way. I've sort of seen people suggest that it could be something which makes super clear that Davros isn't disabled or anymore, or we could have him still sitting in that chair, but like as a sort of throne that he can get up from and walk around from, and he's not always constrained by it. That would be one way to go with this. Or option two would be to just do something completely different, whether it is just having a humanoid or sort of predominantly humanoid and a fully humanoid Davros, or some other, variation, because lest we forget that in basically every Davros story, I think, apart from Genesis, obviously, and then Resurrection as well, every story since has actually introduced us to another variant of Davros, another form of Davros, whether it be in Revelation, where we have that sort of disguised version or the fake version of Davros, where he's in the sort of tube where it's just the head, in Remembrance, where we have the Emperor Davros, where again it's just the head but in this kind of Emperor Dalek body. He also gets his hand blown off in Revelation, and so when we see him again in the new series, that's been replaced by like a metal gauntlet instead of a metal glove. So, although it feels like this image of Davros has remained unchanged for all these years, it has actually been played around with to some extent already without us almost realising it. And then also, obviously, with the Series 9 opener, Magician's Apprentice, which is familiar, that introduced us, technically to the very first humanoid version of Davros, the child Davros. Once again, another version, another facet of this character that isn't just the traditional version that we know from Genesis. And similar ideas have been explored on audio by Big Finish. We had the I, Davros series, the 4-part prequel to Genesis before Magician's Apprentice, before this minisode as well. That was the first time, I believe, that we'd seen or rather heard Davros before the accident, before all the stuff, before the chair, all that stuff. That was when he was still a humanoid, still a Khaled. That's before his voice changed and his look changed, and before all that stuff happened to him. And there's a recent story that I haven't heard, but I believe it was called Palindrome, and that was a similar sort of thing where Terry Malloy, the 80s Davros actor, sort of played another sort of humanoid version of Davros, living a normal life with like a wife and kids or something like that. I don't know, I haven't heard it. But yes, basically, there is a precedent for Doctor Who writers being creative with this sort of thing. And certainly with a character like Davros, who can't just regenerate like the Doctor or the Master, and who can be played by new actors over the years as well, but doesn't really have that same sort of inbuilt element of change to him, just inherently. This would actually completely reinvent him almost, and really give him a new lease of life, and potentially open up loads of new story opportunities and ways for him to interact with Doctor, and ways for actors to bring more of themselves to the performance. With all that said, Davros has appeared 3 times in revived Doctor Who, if we include this minisode, with sort of gaps of 7 or 8 years between each one, so it's probably not that likely that we're actually going to be seeing any of this reach fruition anytime soon. It is all still hypothetical, the way Russell is talking here. But that's his ethos, certainly going forward, whether Davros appears in next year's series or whether it's many more years until we see him again, that appears to be the way that we will see him. Not in the chair, not with a disfigurement, but without the prosthetics and in completely humanoid form. But what are your thoughts about this monumental change to the Daleks' creator? Because yes, I know that Doctor Who fans have very strong views both ways on this. It's a complicated, delicate issue. What do you think of it? Are you open to seeing Davros, in a new form in the future? Do you feel that this is something that is justified? Is it something that bothers you at all? Whatever your thoughts, be sure to let me know down in the comments below. If you have enjoyed this video, please do leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you're new for more stuff like this in the future. But otherwise, until the next one, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye for now.